Welcome to UCC's Global Speakers Series. We're delighted to be joined by alumni and friends who are tuning in from around the world, and we welcome everyone who has joined us here in the Aula Maxima. The Global Speakers Series brings together experts from the alumni community with specialists from UCC to discuss topics of contemporary interest and to explore some of the opportunities and challenges facing our world today. We would like to thank Deloitte, who very kindly sponsor our Global Speaker Series. This evening, we're delighted to welcome back our excellent panellists, Mike O'Sullivan and Professor Andrew Cottey, who have given a number of very insightful Global Speaker Series talks over the years. Tonight, our speakers will be exploring a very timely topic, the global outlook for 2026. Mike and Andrew will be introduced to you shortly by the chair of tonight's discussion, Professor Theresa Reidy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Theresa, who will be known to many of you as a regular contributor in broadcast and print media. In addition to being head of UCC's School of Society, Politics and Ethics, Theresa publishes widely on Irish politics, especially electoral behaviours and political institutions. Theresa has also co-edited a number of books, including Politics in the Republic of Ireland and How Ireland Voted. Welcome, Theresa.
Thank you all very much. Sorry, I'm a little loud. You're all very welcome to UCC. We're delighted to have you here either in person or online with us this evening. I have to say, to begin with, the weather might not be cooperating with us in terms of the event, but global affairs have certainly taken an uptick in the opening days of 2026. So we certainly won't be short of things to talk about here this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers to my left and right. I'm going to begin with Mike O'Sullivan. And again, I know most of you may know our colleagues because this is part of a series of events. But for those that are new to us here this evening, Mike O'Sullivan is the author of The Levelling, which outlines what's next in politics, economics, finance and geopolitics in the post-globalization era. He is also the author of Ireland and the Global Question and What Did We Do Right? And recently, L'Accord du Peuple, he was a member of the World Economic Forum's Council on the New Economy, a Forbes contributor and a speaker at the 2020 TED Talk Conference. He is chair of the Jane Goodall Legacy Foundation and a director of Unio Wealth Management, in addition to advising a number of fintech companies. He has 20 years' experience in global financial markets, most recently as Chief Investment Officer in the International Wealth Management Division of Credit Suisse, where he worked for 12 years. In addition to working in investment management, he was the lead contributor to Credit Suisse think tank, the CS Research Institute, and he studied at UCC, which is obviously the most important piece of information to share with you all this evening, before he moved on to Balliol College at Oxford, where he received his MPhil and his DPhil. He was an independent member of Ireland's National Economic and Social Council from 2011 to 2016 and has contributed to journals like Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, in addition to being a regular guest on CNN, BBC, CNBC and Bloomberg. And so we are delighted to have you with us this evening, Mike. And now I turn to my right and your left, and it's a great pleasure to introduce my long-standing colleague, Professor Andrew Cottey, who works with me here in the Department of Government and Politics at UCC. Andrew is an expert in international politics and an EU Jean Monnet Chair in European Political Integration. He has been a NATO Research Fellow, a Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a visiting researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and was chair of the Royal Irish Academy Standing Committee on International Affairs. He is currently chair of the board of the British American Security Information Council, an NGO that works to advance nuclear arms control and disarmament. And so, Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you here as well. Now, I'm going to actually begin with a rather open question because this is the continuation of a series of these talks with exactly the same two speakers. And I might maybe just kind of start with a kind of an open question. You've been giving these talks for a few years now, and what are the threads, I suppose, that you see that have developed over that particular period of time? So how might you kind of tie global affairs together at this juncture? And I'll hand over to you first. Andrew, please.
Okay, great. Well thanks, Theresa, and good evening, everyone. I mean, Mike and I were discussing this beforehand, and it did prompt me to think, and I think the single biggest thing I would say is the retreat of democracy globally. I mean, you know, Theresa always likes to know the data and the numbers. She's a very good political scientist, but you know, you can look at the numbers. The numbers of democracies have fallen in the world. There's evidence to suggest that the quality of democracy has declined, and there's also evidence that people's faith in democracy has declined. So if I look at a kind of medium-term trend, sadly, I would say that it's the retreat, thankfully not complete, but the partial retreat of democracy. And I think for me, it's not just a domestic issue, but it also impacts international politics. And it's not quite as simple as democracies versus autocracies in the world, but there's a fairly big grain of truth in that. And I think, you know, this then links into the European theme that Mike and I will mention. I think if you look at it from a European perspective, if you looked at the 1990s, 2000s, America was Europe's key ally. Russia was democratizing, at least up to maybe the early mid 2000s, and China was liberalizing, and Russia and China were partners of Europe. If you look at the world today, the US is at best an unreliable ally, maybe even an adversary, and we'll return to that theme. And Russia and China, in different ways, are deeply problematic for Europe. So, as I say, my sort of starting takeaway would be the retreat of democracy and what that means for Europe, amongst other things.
It's interesting you say that because I am a data scientist first and foremost, and I was telling my fourth years yesterday evening that I was updating slides, and it was really very depressing. Freedom House released their data earlier in the week, and I just changed the heading on the slide from 18 years of democratic retrenchment to 19 years of democratic retrenchment. And when you see the data like that, it's pretty hard hitting, and the kind of slow decline over the last 20 years or so, it's a kind of it really is a depressing vista.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming along tonight. So I spoke at an event like this in October on much the same theme. And afterwards, a lady came up to me, and she is a dual Irish-Danish citizen. And she said, you know, I kind of live in two parallel worlds, because in Ireland, we're ignoring everything that's happening. But if I listen to the Danish news, they are telling us to hold cash, to hoard fruit, food in case there's a war with Russia. And I kind of nodded in agreement with her, and both of us were ignorant of the fact that the Danes could actually end up fighting America. And the point of saying that is that you know, it shows that this is a world that is turned upon its head. It's a topsy-turvy world, and just the velocity of events and change is bewildering. So just to try and step back from all the events and look at the big picture, we're in a sort of an end of regime. So we've had a period of globalization, most peaceful, prosperous phase in world history, perhaps ever, bookended by two democratic moments, to Andrew's point, the fall of communism, the spread of democracy, and then the end, I think, of democracy in Hong Kong, marking the end of globalization. And we're into something much more uncertain. And I have a kind of a rule of thumb, which I call the rule of unraveling, which is and it's a slightly pessimistic rule, but to look at all the good things that happened during globalization, democracy, world institutions, and watch how they're being undermined and unraveled. Democracy is one. NATO, where Andrew is an expert, could be another one very, very soon. The central role of the US in the economic system could yet be another one. And where I think we're going is on a kind of a long journey to what people call a multipolar world. And that's important for Ireland because a multipolar world is a world of maybe 4 regions: China-centric Asia, the US, Europe, and very likely kind of the Gulf, which is a region of growth and maybe promise. And each of those regions is big and also will do things in an increasingly different way to the other. So if you look at AI, so the internet used to be global, used to be universal. Now it's very siloed. AI is becoming sovereign. And it's important to us because we're kind of caught on the fault line of the US and Europe, and like many other countries like Singapore, will increasingly be forced to choose. So this kind of journey, I think, could take, who knows, 15, 16 years until we have a more settled world order. And there's lots of challenges. It's a bit like the Hobbit going through all his challenges of debt. Governments have never been as indebted. There's a democratic crisis. There is a climate crisis. Balanced against all that is the promise of technology. So we're in this kind of interregnum period where lots of things are up for grabs. And, the Trump administration is just the first attempt to kind of remake the world order. And we'll probably have a few more iterations of that until we reach a calm.
And I completely see what you're saying, that it could take some time for the kind of dust to settle and for us to kind of understand the direction of travel. But we're kind of entering the second quarter of the 21st century. But in the first 20 days of 2026, it seems like there's been an immense acceleration of activity on the world stage. And so we had a series of questions, but I now have kind of 3 words. I have Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland. And it just seems like a lot in a 3-week period, albeit that this is probably something that we need to think about over a longer period of time. And I might hand over to you, Andrew, and you might want to take your pick of Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland, but maybe also, is there talk to us about the thread that unites these,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I suppose is kind of Trump whispering in that sense. Look in the newspapers, read the newspaper op-eds, and there's an awful lot of how do we understand President Trump and the Trump administration? And it kind of, looking at that stuff, it ranges from some stuff which says that there's kind of a secret strategy and the Trumpists know exactly what they're doing, to some people who even say that it's just a bunch of stuff, and President Trump wakes up any given day and he feels in whatever mood. So I'll give you my sort of take on it. I think there's a kind of simplistic definition of US interests, that it's a crude definition. More territory, more oil, etc. Means America is bigger, better, and stronger. And also there's kind of a crude calculation of power, and people might have seen Stephen Miller is one of Trump's key advisors, and there's this quote from him, which is kind of like the sort of arch realpolitik, where he said recently, this is a world of power, and we'll do what we will. And I think that's kind of what's going on. And if you think about the Greenland bit, it seems to me that the Trump logic is territory is good, more territory is better, a bigger America will be better. And you wimpy Europeans, well, we're powerful, you're weaker than us, you just have to comply. And that seems to be the kind of logic. And maybe as the footnote, just to add, Trump likes President William McKinley from the late 19th century, and I think he sees himself as the man who might, add this big chunk of new territory to the United States. And maybe just finally on the Greenland bit, I actually think that Trump is overreaching. Venezuela is one thing, Venezuela is not a democracy, not an ally of the United States. The Maduro regime was not very nice, but Denmark is part of NATO. Denmark's a democracy. It's a long-standing ally of the United States. If you look at the public opinion figures, there's almost no support for some kind of military action or even some kind of peaceful takeover of Greenland. In addition, Trump, I think, has pushed the Europeans so far that this time Europe has no choice but to push back. But at the same time, President Trump isn't dialing down the rhetoric. So where this Greenland stuff goes, I really don't know.
They're meeting this week on the side of Davos, as we understand. Well, that was what I saw before I came over to this meeting. I can't guarantee that that's still true, but as we understand it, they're supposed to meet this week.
So none of this, so there's three things. There's Trump, there's the world order, then there's US institutions. And none of this could happen if the world wasn't unbalanced, and none of it could happen if people didn't enable Trump. So just first of all, on Trump, the individual, I mean, he is opportunistic, he is venal. If you speak to people who worked for him in the previous administration, he does not like embroilments, which is why he's actually made a relatively small incursion into Venezuela with the help of the current regime, and actually left it worse off. There's probably terrible things happening there now under this reiteration of the old regime. So he doesn't like to get into sort of politically, economically costly conflicts, which I think is probably good for Denmark and for Greenland. Secondly, the people around him, there's a big difference between this Trump administration and the first one. The first one was chaotic. Trump himself has learned a lot from that chaos. He has a team around him who are subservient and who, but at the same time, I think, have the same ideological and opportunistic bent as he does. And if you look at some of the recent documents, like the National Security Strategy, which is a slightly kind of, schoolboy geopolitical document. You were talking, Andrew, about marking exams, and you probably give it a, D minus. It speaks to the idea of kind of spheres of influence, which, with some degree of irony, is a very Russian idea, that there's sort of parts of the world that are kind of divided up into, the Russians control the East, and they agitate Europe, and the Chinese control Asia, etc. So that's a philosophy. And I think there are still a lot of people in the States who see this as somehow attractive. And I think we are into a slightly imperial and hubristic period of American history. Ironically, again, of course, on the 250th anniversary of American democracy.
And, sorry, I'm going to go a little bit off script now, off piste, and I'm going to say, if this is about imperialism and it's about territory, we've already had the first wave of this. He was taking Canada there at the start of his term in office, and he was making all kinds of assertions against the Canadians. I mean, I suppose we have to ask this: like, how serious should we take this whole situation regarding Greenland? I mean, the Canada thing kind of faded, and there's lots of memes going around on Twitter and all the social media networks this week of Mark Carney not taking phone calls, and I think fundamentally that's one of the big questions people have about Trump. He says things. He puts them out there, but then he gets distracted by other items on the agenda. And like, how far can we put the whole Greenland crisis in that context? Is there something that, could he change his mind in 2 weeks' time and be distracted by something else?
So he is not a reliable partner. He's not someone with whom you can do a durable trade deal. And I think, however, the people behind him have a strategy, which is to conquer as much as they can. I think Trump has a very clear negotiating tactic, which is very Russian, which is put my tanks on your lawn in a very hostile, illegal way, and then see what I can bargain from that. So I think Greenland, what he's doing in Greenland, is very, very opportunistic. I think the dilemma for other politicians and for kind of normal, skilled politicians, Mark Carney is the best example, is that he has changed the perception of the use of power. So he's woken American people up to the fact that the president can do things by decree, by executive orders. He's used more executive orders in the last year than he used in the previous 4-year term. And also he seems to get things done with a speed that makes Keir Starmer, Macron, Merz look sluggish, powerless and incompetent. So it's not so much that he's pushing into Greenland, but he's kind of changing the rules on the use and the perception of power as well.
Do you want to come in on that, Andrew?
Again, just on the Greenland bit, I do think it's really hard to tell, because I think Mike's absolutely correct that Trump doesn't want to get into an Afghanistan or an Iraq, and that the Venezuela thing, in a sense, was perfect from Trump's perspective. You go in, you get Maduro, the American boys come home, as it were, and you've got the bad guy. Little footnote to that, if anyone's been looking at the detail of this, one of the American helicopters that went into Venezuela was damaged. It was shot at and damaged, and one of the American soldiers, was shot and injured. So the perception that this was a perfect military operation, in the end, it went well for Trump and for the Americans. But imagine if that helicopter had come down, and suddenly 20 Marines were now held hostage in the Venezuelan capital. So these things can easily go wrong. Circle back to Greenland. You could see Trump might just say to the military, I want you to put 5,000 troops on the ground in Greenland in a month's time, and Trump might think that's kind of a relatively risk-free and cost-free option. So I certainly can't tell you what's going to happen in Greenland, and I really find it really hard to judge, because I think the possibility that Trump could do that, could decide it looks like a low-risk and easy political win, but there are other factors as well.
And whenever someone has raised the cost to him of doing something, be it the Canadians boycotting American goods or China with rare earth, he's pulled back immediately, and he's someone who is dead to shame. He doesn't think twice about kind of doing a quick U-turn.
Yeah, and I suppose actually from both of you, I want to pick up on Iran. Yeah. This is immensely risky. You mentioned hostages. That's actually what made me say let's stay on this for a moment. The last round of interventions and the kind of grand design for Iran from decades ago, it didn't go very well for the United States. I mean, in terms of his rhetoric, that again also seemed to kind of ramp up and then suddenly temper and go away. Where do we think this is going to go? I mean, what plan does he have? Is he going to stay provoking the regime in Iran, which in of itself appears to be immensely unstable at the present time?
Yeah, so I think there's actually very little he can do in Iran for a series of reasons. So Iran is just a brilliant country in terms of its heritage and the culture and the education of the people. So it's untypically modern for that region. Iranians historically, given the coup, I think 1955, and then they don't like Western intervention, and it's perhaps the only country where they regard MI6 as being a kind of globally powerful kind of mastermind. So even people who are protesting in the streets would have some aversion to Israel, US, etc., fomenting some kind of revolution. Second thing is that there's no obvious opposition. Anyone who raises anyone public who raises a hand against the regime is put in jail or they're killed. And people talk about the son of the Shah, and I think that's very much a Western kind of foible. I don't think he would be acceptable to Iranians as as a leader. So it's quite a hard country, I think, to do kind of traditional regime change. It's also a country on the cusp of an economic disaster. And as with all revolutions, what's really provoking people is the cost of living, scarcity of food, electricity, etc. And I suspect that we will have to wait till Khamenei dies. He has cancer, he's 86, and then there will be a kind of the regime will stay in place, but it'll be a slightly softer, more pragmatic regime. So I personally don't see a kind of a wholesale revolution in Iran. And it is very, I would just say it's personally very disappointing that 12,000 people have been killed in 2 weeks. And in the West, there's not a flicker. I mean, there was, walked past a protest in Paris on Sunday, it was like maybe 1,000 people. So we're not really registering this in our Western societies, and we should be.
And I might actually, Andrew, in your case, if you want to comment on Iran, but I might also contrast that with the other, of course, big conflict that really is registering on the streets, and that's the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in Palestine and the Gaza, which is kind of on the global agenda, and where the peace plan is. I mean, this week, all of the announcements about Trump's peace initiative and the appointments onto his peace summit, some of it seems serious. On the other hand, some of the appointments seemed rather kind of random and unserious, and kind of, I suppose, maybe comment on where we see the conflict going into 2026 and Trump's involvement in it.
Absolutely, thanks, Theresa. Well, and just to say on Iran, I very much agree with Mike. I mean, even if the Americans bomb Iran, who or what are they going to bomb? They're not going to be able to take out the regime as such. So then what happens? So even if the US takes military action in Iran, it seems highly unlikely that the result of that will be the collapse of the regime. And I have to say, I mean, the kind of Israel-Palestine bit is really depressing. When is a ceasefire not a ceasefire? I mean, we have a kind of drip feed of people sadly being killed still by Israeli military action, and still an ongoing kind of humanitarian disaster on the ground in Gaza, a kind of explosive situation in the West Bank with the expansion of settlements and settler violence. And the other thing, of course, is that there will be the Israeli elections, and I suppose the hope for many people was that maybe we would get a new Israeli government without Prime Minister Netanyahu, which might be more inclined to inch forward the efforts towards peace. But I mean, I suppose the one thing we do know is that Mr. Netanyahu has been a brilliant political survivor, so I wouldn't bet on him not being Israeli Prime Minister at the end of this year. So I mean, I find the Israel-Palestine thing, it's just really depressing in terms of, well, A, the lack of progress, and B, the difficulty of even seeing where we could get progress. And to Mike's point about Trump's lack of attention, President Trump is the chair of the Board of Peace, but it wouldn't appear that he's been giving a great deal of attention to the matter since the ceasefire was agreed.
Well, you mentioned elections, and I think a matter that Trump probably is paying some attention to are his own elections coming up in November. And there's a lot of speculation in terms of how he's positioning some of these policies in relation to the midterms, up to and including that he has some secret plan to actually cancel the midterms or suspend them in some way. I suppose I might start with you, Mike, in terms of kind of how do you see that playing out, and I'll come to you then, Andrew.
Yeah, so I think unfortunately the view of America from without or from outside America is more grave. than within, because we're suffering a lot of the side effects. And I think there are still a lot of people in America who are content with what he's doing on the economy, immigration, talking down the weak Europeans. I think Greenland is probably steps over a red line. So he still has quite a lot of support in a lot of places. There's a few things I would look at, and so one group of those supporters is Irish America, because Irish America has kind of flipped from being majority of kind of Democrat voters to a lot of them enabling and enjoying Trump. But I think there's a few things to watch. One is just the degradation of institutions and the rule of law. So the Federal Reserve is kind of the institution, along with the Supreme Court, par excellence of the US. And that is being undercut and undermined. And together with the rule of law, this will eventually have implications. We're in a year when the stock market valuations are as high as they were in 1929. It's a sort of totemic year. I mentioned, an imperial year when American democracy is 250 years old. So the risks and the distance to fall is quite far. So I think watching the degradation of institutions and how well and how with capability they fight back is interesting. I think Trump is strong because the Democrats are weak. And the Democrats, I think, are having this kind of very muddled existential crisis as to do they push left or do they come back in the center? And there was we had elections in November for the governorship of a couple of states, a couple of really interesting female candidates like Mikey Sherrill in Pennsylvania, Abigail Spanberger in I think Virginia. Very capable people, very, very centrist. So there is some change beginning to come through. So I think having the midterms as a check on Trump and the people behind him is going to be a crucial battle.
I am going to have to push you a little bit, just because we have an. Do you think that he's going to cede control? That he's going to be more imperiled, his political position will be more imperiled after the elections?
What I think he's going to do. So the other thing I didn't mention is just is the economy, the link between the economy and politics. So if you travel to America recently, I mean, it is ferociously expensive, and it is becoming the most unequal society ever. And they have this idea of kind of the K-shaped economy, where the top 10% of wealthy people account for 50% of all the spending, and that everyone else is kind of suffering and trading down. So he will do things in the next 6 months to, he'll take some of the tariff money and spread it around, or he will bully companies to try and reduce prices. So that's probably the most likely avenue in terms of his strategy. I think it would be a stretch, but also an existential moment if he gets away with somehow manipulating the elections.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have commented on the New York mayor, Mondani's win, and what it said about kind of the general economic conditions on the ground and the attractiveness of what they call socialism, which for us Europeans is so entertaining, but even just the kind of modest proposals that he was putting out there in relation to public transport, public housing, childcare, it really did seem to resonate with the voters. I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is, are the Republicans in trouble on the economy? What he's doing with Powell, with the Fed, with the dollar, it could go horribly wrong very quickly.
It could go horribly wrong, yeah. And I think in a way, Europe and America, in a perfect world, would actually learn from each other. So they would have better public transport, public healthcare, education. We'd have bigger armies and bigger capital markets. But we're now having a divorce with the Americans, so that's unlikely to happen.
Andrew, I'll hand over to you on that note.
Yeah, I have to say, I think this 2026 is absolutely a fork in the road moment for the United States. These midterm elections. If the Democrats win back at least the House and maybe the Senate, and we have reasonably fair elections, that's one scenario. if Trump is able to cancel, bribe, manipulate the elections, we're heading into kind of Hungary, soft authoritarian territory in the United States. And I mean, if you just think about, some of the possibilities, obviously we have all these ICE and border patrol activities in big American cities. Arguably one of the aims of those is to provoke violence. So imagine that succeeds. The elections go ahead, but President Trump says, unfortunately, it just won't be possible to hold elections in some of these big cities, which happen to be predominantly Democratic cities. Or imagine the scenario where President Trump declares that some of the results from the elections are illegal. It goes into a court case. Some of the courts say, well, yes, maybe these elections are illegal. Or imagine the scenario even where the outgoing Congress refuses to seat some of the elected representatives, and we get, large-scale violence. So for me, 250th anniversary of the United States, unhappy birthday, America. But I really think this depending what happens with these midterm elections, it's really a fork in the road moment for the United States.
It's almost an apocalyptic scenario that you are kind of painting for, the world's most important democracy. I suppose the question is, how likely do you think that is? And maybe more, what will the signs be? At what point will we kind of know that this is the kind of avenue that we're about to go down?
Well, I guess, we will have a clearer picture by the autumn once you get closer to the election. So number one, what are the opinion polls? In a sense, a big Democratic win will be very hard for President Trump and his supporters to deny or push back. But if it's close, so let's say maybe the economic situation improves, and as Mike mentioned, one of the things that some of Trump's supporters about, I think maybe even President Trump, that people might be given $1,000 or a $2,000 tariff check. So the tariff money, which in a sense is fictional, will be used to bribe the American electorate, and the deficit hawks of the Republican Party will have to bite their lip. And then if it's much closer, a little bit of manipulation there. Were the voter rolls really reliable in County X and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it'll be through the autumn and through the elections itself. But if you have a very strong showing for the Democrats and a very clear win in the elections, that's one scenario. It's the kind of intermediate scenarios that maybe are more worrying, I think.
I suppose I'm going to kind of move across the Atlantic then and say, where does Europe fit in all of this? And I might ask you to kind of focus on kind of the immediate issues around how Europe is responding to the Greenland challenge, that there seems to be a divide between a group of countries who are kind of saying it's time to stand up to the bully versus a kind of another cluster of countries who are maybe still talking about diplomacy, but then also take us through this period towards the end of the year, and how do European countries position themselves, react, if we start to see serious degeneration in the US democracy?
Yeah. So this has all been instigated by Trump, by Russia, by China, each of whom in different ways is kind of kicking poor old nice democratic Europe, and I wish it were not the case. The European view of the world is in my view, the best one. Many of you remember George Bush Jr. when he was president. He was surrounded by a group of people called the neocons, and they were these kind of apparently fierce, warlike advisors. With great irony, Dick Cheney, who was the lead neocon, kind of died as a kind of a liberal. He was one of the prominent voices against Trump. And Europe, and what defined the neocons is that they were liberals who have been mugged by reality. And Europe is having its neocon moment. So we are all nice, pro-democratic liberals, very cultivated, very cultured, and we are being, every week, it's not just Greenland, every week, particularly since the Munich Security Conference this time last year, being mugged by the reality of Trump and Russia and China. And in a way, that's our privilege as a kind of as open societies and democracies. Having said that, my personal view is I do not think that European leaders have done a very good job of handling this transition from globalization to a rougher world. They have kept up with the pace of the bullies, as you put it. So they're always reacting, always flying off to Washington to save Ukraine or flying to Davos to try and save Greenland. So if you like, the tempo is being set by the US or by Russia. And then there's a whole litany of things Russia has done, from espionage to sabotage, that hasn't really been pushed back on sufficiently aggressively. So this kind of mugging process, as they say, the beatings will continue until morale improves. So one of the things, I think there's two things Europe can do. One is to recapture the narrative. So the narrative is not that, Europe is always regulating, etc., but that for 95% of the things that people in the world want, democracy, healthcare, education, a place to bring up families, Europe is the best place to be. And unlike other places, it's not violent and it's not corrupt. So we have to kind of have a European narrative, and it has to be pushed by our leaders. Secondly, I think all this will continue until Europe strikes back and has a kind of what the French would call a riposte. So until Europe does something very harsh and violent and tough to an enemy country, for example, fomenting a revolution in Belarus, or banning Russian tourists from Europe, or having some kind of military confrontation with Russia, then I think we will not be in the sort of the mode of standing up for ourselves. There's just two other challenges, if I can very quickly. Difficult year for kind of democratic politicians. Macron could be unseated this year. Starmer will probably go. Merz is not popular. So there's also an issue of the labour market for politicians in Europe. And one of the sad things, I suppose, is that no one wants to be a politician at a time when we need leaders the most. And the final thing I'll say is that Ireland is in a different planet, a different universe in terms of the whole debate. So I live between Cork and Paris, and it's, it is different universe. So in France, the head of the army said publicly, every French family should be ready to lose one of their children in a war. In Sweden, they are handing out leaflets as to telling people how to prepare for war. I've mentioned Denmark. The Poles want war with Russia tomorrow. So the mood in Europe is very different. And industrially, all these countries are rearming at a rapid rate. I mean, the US has got an AI boom. We have a defense boom in Europe, with the exception of Ireland.
Do you really think, though, that European leaders at the present time, given how riven with division most European polities are, that they're in a place where they can make a case for Europe? The populist right or the populist left are certainly in the ascendancy in some countries. Yeah. They're very disruptive in others. How hopeful or how optimistic are you of this, defense of Europe, persuading European leaders?
So I think if you look at the last maybe 10 years, Europe has actually got stronger in three aspects, right? But in each case, it's required a very difficult crisis. So Europe is stronger financially and economically because of the Eurozone crisis. We have the mechanism now to deal with a financial crisis. We have new debt mechanisms. So that's one. Brexit has made Europe more united in terms of the solidarity with countries, in particular with Ireland. And if you look at the UK, I mean, the UK is lost at sea absolutely lost at sea and it's kind of drifting back towards Europe now. That makes the point that, being in a big collective is much better. And then very quickly, Europe is becoming stronger in defense. So by 2027, Europe will have the second, or for the US, second highest spending on military. So we get there in a kind of a slow, clunky way, and it requires a really good push to get there. I do think there is a labour market problem in Europe. We don't have, Macron has tried to do it and failed spectacularly, kind of charismatic politician who can speak to ordinary Europeans, but also speak a global message. And I think also the other thing is that centrist governments in every country have to realize that they have to do kind of nasty stuff, that if you don't tackle things that are on people's minds, be it immigration, the unsavory far right will come and promise to do it for you, and they will do a much worse job, actually.
Andrew, can I come to you? Where do you see Europe marginalised in world affairs, or do you see kind of reasons for optimism?
I'll actually give you one reason for optimism, which has been the Greenland response. I mean, if you look at the first year of Trump 2.0, the European response has been, oh my God, let's not disrupt Trump. So Trump imposes tariffs, and we say yes, sir. Trump backs off on Ukraine, and we agree to Trump's negotiations. So on Greenland, I thought that there was a statement from 7 European countries, UK, Germany, Poland, Nordics and Netherlands, I think it was, which was pretty robust pushback on Greenland. And this time when Trump threatened tariffs, if we didn't effectively hand over Greenland, the European Commission is starting to look at retaliatory tariffs. So I think there's kind of a learning kind of a process there. So on the Greenland thing, I actually see some element of kind of hope in terms of Europe beginning to push back against President Trump and the Trump administration. The other thing I think is that Europe's learning that it has to build its ties with others. So the US is no longer a reliable ally. Russia and China are problematic, but Japan, Canada, South Korea, Australia, India, Europe is beginning to develop political and trade ties with all these countries. So there's an element of kind of, the free world, the democratic world without the United States beginning to come together. But I mean, Mike is right. I mean, Europe has been weak from various perspectives, but there are maybe some seeds of hope there. And maybe just on final remark on Ireland. Obviously, Ireland will have the presidency of the EU in the second half of this year, and it's going to be caught on a range of difficult things. One small footnote is Ireland will host something called the European Political Community, which is a big summit, I think, in October of this year, and I'm kind of looking to see what Ireland is going to do about things like drone defence and air defence when all these European leaders will be flying into Dublin to meet at the convention centre.
So I'm struck by that phrase you used earlier, mugged by reality. Do you think Ireland is going to be mugged by reality as it enters into the second half of this year and it has to manage these challenges?
Absolutely, yes. So Ireland in the last 50 or so years, we've lived through kind of 3 periods. There was the 70s to 1990, Jolie described as a period of great economic underperformance, and then globalization, where we've done brilliantly, where the exemplar, it's transformed the economy, transformed society, and now we're into a different world, but we refuse to accept it. I mean, partly because we're still living on the vapors of globalization. We're still pulling in lots of money from multinationals. Our economy is very, very strong. So there's not a great incentive, if you like, to kind of learn those lessons, even though they're right before us. So we have 120, 30,000 Ukrainians living in the country, but we have never drawn the conclusion, sort of, why are they here? Because Russia is targeting Europe. Should we not have a better security defense mechanism, and it kind of goes back to what Sean O'Faolain, a good Corkman, called the green curtain, where we draw a green curtain across Ireland and the rest of the world and slightly ignore what's happening. So I think there's just a couple of challenges. So I mentioned at the start that the world will have different challenges in the next 15 years. A debt crisis. We are actually in a very good position in terms of the national balance sheet. And we should be marketing Ireland as a country that will become not a risk basket case, but a safe haven. So that's a positive. The world is having a democratic crisis. Ireland actually is an example to other countries like France as to how to bring democracy closer to the people. So that's a good point. Climate, I think we're still in denial as to how climate will affect us. And then there is security. And I think part of the problem there is that security is not at all in the mindset of our politicians and policymakers. It's just not in their DNA. And unlike other small countries like Sweden and Denmark, who've been doing this for 400 or 500 years, it's just not in our mindsets. And if we were to have an army the size of those countries, I mean, when people worry about Cork, they worry about Apple and Pfizer. And those, I think, in my view, are not real threats. I mean, what would transform Cork is if we had a navy the size of Denmark, Norway, or Sweden. We'd have 70 ships, not 2 active ships. The university would focus more on deep tech, on engineering. There'd be a kind of an officer corps, etc. So a lot of these things will come down the line, and we have to. And war and security are deadly things. You can't do them halfway, and we're only doing them a third of the way at the moment. And it will change the fiscal outlook on Ireland as well. We would have to spend, I estimate, 15-20 billion a year for the next 10 years to have an army like other small advanced economies. So that's a huge challenge.
I might actually give you a last word. And Andrew, you're a very seasoned observer of kind of defence and security politics in Ireland. As I've heard you talk many times, the lack of defence and security. How likely is that there will be an outbreak of maturity? Because it would really be a sea change in terms of public, but also elite, engagement with these issues. Do you see that for Ireland?
It's hard because I think there's little political incentive, and unless and until something bad happens, there's rather little incentive for any politician to say we need to spend, as Mike says, pretty significantly more on defence. When you've already got a housing crisis, you've already got, the cost of the Children's Hospital in Dublin, you've already got, a challenging situation in the health service. People like Micheál Martin, for instance, and Simon Coveney might have been another one, have made the case for more defence spending, but not on the kind of scale that Mike mentioned. So I think the political incentives work against it. And I suppose, touch wood, touch the table leg here. Hopefully it won't take something really bad happening to trigger that change.
Might not be the most opportune moment to draw the conversation to a close. I think we can all agree there's a really insightful discussion that we've had this evening, albeit going through some very difficult topics and a pretty troubling outlook that we have for the year ahead. At this point in proceedings, we're going to draw the kind of online section to a close, and I'm going to hand over to Karen. But everybody in the room, stay with us, and we're going to follow Karen's instructions. Thank you very much.